Hello everyone, today we talk about the brethren of the monastic military orders habits. A couple of months ago I already made one about the Teutonic orders, more specifically the habit of Conrad of Thuringia from his tomb effigy. He was the great master of Teutonic order between 1239 and 1241, and that source is very good. We however extended it a bit to the Teutonic habit. We looked at other sources as well as the differences, the variations in these clothing. That is not entirely clear, as we will understand better in, say, with precision for every single moment of these orders' history, especially the one that we see today, essentially of the between the 11th and the 13th century. In any case, let's approximate this. Again, for the Teutonic Order, you have the comprehensive video that also deals, by the way, with the Brethren of the Sword and the Knights of the Order Dobrzhin, which adds up to the thing. Today, actually, we will talk about other orders, such as the one of the Hospital of St. Lazarus, the one of St. Thomas of Canterbury at Acre, as well as the Knights of Our Lady of Montjoie, right, also known as the ones of Truffaut, after the fall of Jerusalem in 1187 in the hands of Saladin. I also made two videos about the Templar and the Hospitalier Knights, respectively, which mostly deals with the military side of the story extensively, like arms and armor. Today we talk just about the habit, right? So what these guys wore in combat was another thing, right? But it's important because it essentially establishes some important precedents for the uniformation of military dress. Historically, we resumed this topic recently when talking about the paradoxically Protestant resuming of the ancient Catholic, in fact, orders uniforms, say model, right? That is fascinating for reasons of strictly military importance, and indeed, as you know, these monastic military orders constituted the elite of the elite, the crème de la crème, in as much as they were designed conceptually to basically take down as many people, let's say 30 people, 30 enemies, before going themselves as martyrs, right, to the death, right? There is a rich military history of the monastic military orders. In the first years of Schwerpunkt, we also observed that you can find that in the Crusaders playlist, right? Multiple battles that sort of exemplify the behavior of the this elite that was, especially in the Holy Land, like literally the backbone of the local Christian knighthood, right? And they would, in this best, also in fact save strategically and tactically many desperate situations, just because of their spirit of sacrifice and the fact that they were truly trained without distractions into military perfection, which is something that historically had always been happening to some extent. I will not digress on how, of course, there is a modernization and secularization of the knight between the 11th and 13th century. It may seem strange during, in fact, the peak of the crusading era, but of course, over time, right, things had been changing, and also the experience in the Holy Land contributed to that. The fact that things faded there in terms of Christian control is also an example of this. I made multiple videos explaining a bit this sunset of the crusade. I made a video about the Battle of Hattin. I made a video last year about the Siege of Acre as well. Siege warfare naturally is underrated also in the resistance capacities of these guys. Some orders went on historically, most of them actually. Others instead basically died out, were taken out at least consistently from what they had been before. But today we talk again about the habit that also can tell, of course, a lot about the psychology, the symbolism, the values of these guys. right? And how much these were universally meant, how much the papacy, the empire, was behind the regularization, the uniformation, and the maintenance, right? The same survival of these orders in a world that again was witnessing the decline of the same universal authorities. The national monarchs, so-called national monarchies, were rising, and they were seen, in fact, even in these orders, a sort of an anachronism. Think about the Templars and their persecution in France, and all the full actual military quality that had been going on in the latter phase of the 13th century, and the wealth they had accumulated, and how much their properties contributed to the building of the French kingdom at that point, the consolidation actually in a moment of crisis. So we will hopefully cover all this stuff in some depth, right? But the military meaning of this symbolism, morally, politically, culturally, is something you really want to appreciate. Again, about the Teutonic Knights, we went in greater depth. Today we sort of compared the three major ones, like the Hospitallers, the Templars, and the same Teutonic Knights, plus talking about the aforementioned sort of minor orders. I mean, it's not nice to call them like that, but objectively. And surely at some point we will make lots of other videos about, I don't know, the Spanish orders of the Reconquista. There is plenty of them, as a matter of fact, as there were many more crusades than we actually think, like I said, from the canonic ones that we numbered. But everything was in many ways much more spontaneous, right? And I think, look at the other day we made a video about medieval Savoy, and we observed how, for example, the Order of Saint Maurice had been a thing since the 11th century, eventually was revived at some point in the 15th century. We've seen in the video about Dragulia, about the Order of the Dragon. But these are also some of the more famous. But back in the day, when all this stuff was not fully regularized and, in fact, controlled, and consolidated and organized, like, there were many of these. I mean, the very major orders were born in the ways that we do not even know precisely the details of, right? And that emerged among many others, right? The Middle Ages had a very corporatistic mentality where this universal body would have all, a bit like Leibniz philosophy, all smaller universes within that. And in fact, that's the same name from which our university term comes from, because as we've seen the many videos dedicated to that topic, university, which in Latin means something that is turned towards the same, that's the single objective that represents the will of this community, was in fact the standard term used at the time in the West to call different communities, including these ones. So, starting from the Hospitallers, again, there is a video about both the Templars and the Hospitallers, that Knights. I didn't do that for the Teutonics, but we will hopefully get there somewhat soon. So yes, I made a video about the Ordenstadt, etc., but talking about historical military units, like this video also fits in technically. Aside from just the clothes, dress, the military context is there for further insight. So, a brother of the Hospitallers order would normally wear the famous black hooded mantle, known as Kappa Clausa, so the closed cap, right, of the hospital, right? And also famously enough, they had a white cross sewn on it, right? In 1118, Raymond Dupuy succeeded Gerald, the founder of the same Hospitallers, and it was Raymond who proposed the order to take up his own arms. So technically, there wasn't really arms or armor before this time, right? We will see that also for the Templars. Initially, there was a great deal of again, these were simply knights that decided to join into this brotherhood, right? It wasn't an originary, like a foundational moment in which, all these knights were, say, created out of scratch as the order. They participated into it. There was plenty of them, right? If you look at this is a very interesting topic actually about that connects the knightly companies of this time to really to the war bands of the migration era and the ancient world, right? The brotherhood of the Wolf, of King Arthur. There was plenty of them all over Western Europe, and this sort of, again, orders were eventually the bit more aristocratic evolution of the system, aside from, of course, the monastic ones that were a bit more sui generis, let's say. In any case, the cross, right, sewn on the black hood, like the white cross, was adopted at some time before 1153. Right, and probably was quite small. We think, as we've seen also for the Teutonic one, that in some iconographic sources is pretty larger. For example, the one of the Monastic, looking at the Minnesänger Tannhäuser, right, more famous even because of Wagner, but for the more cultivated, of course, because of the early of his compositions in the 13th century, was something like 17 centimeters deep, right? While the characteristic 8-pointed cross of the Hospitallers, right, with the bifurcation fundamentally at the end of the arms, seems to have been introduced in the first quarter of the 13th century. However, it wouldn't replace the older cross formé, and it was apparently not worn with the military dress specifically. Right, during the 12th, the early 13th century, we also have the uniform for the brother knights and the brother sergeants, right? That was the latter, which was a black or brown kappa, right? So the latter had also sort of more, less valuable, of course, clothing, also in the symbolic hierarchy. Right, and it seems this to have been, however, for both a full robe with sleeves and hood, and as far as the military dress, the equipment was concerned, like this kappa would be worn over armor, right? It had a surcoat, right, and it had a small white cross on the left side of the chest, just like also for practical reasons of recognition. In fact, it seems, again, that also in the mid 13th century, in 1248 specifically, a papal decree established that the brother knights and brother sergeant could wear also white-black surcoats, specifically with a small cross on it. This was granted only for situations of danger and likely combat in this regard, simply for the sake of recognition. Hence, the uniform function as well that was particularly important. As we have seen in multiple videos, of course, Crusaders had always sort of distinguished themselves through these devices. We talk often about this, like in pre-heraldic times. Heraldry is actually a early modern discipline, right? When we look at the Middle Ages, that technically that things were not called in heraldic terms, had not been at least standardized in the way it was sort of more categorized later, when chivalry had sort of not died out, but at least had compacted in a much more oligarchic fashion. And so these early times were actually much more fluid as far as that was concerned. We've seen it in many, and there was still, however, if not more, even the greater connection with the actual symbolism of not just of the devices, but also the same colors that we will see now. All right, black, for example, for the Hospitaller, but also the Teutonic Knights, was referring to the sins of the world that these knights were to take on themselves in their self-sacrifice in the holy combat, like in the best passages of the Laude Nove Militia by Bernard of Clairvaux. that, as we have explained in one video, was actually the same identical Indo-European doctrine of self-sacrifice surviving at this point, untouched in many ways, and not just for the monastic military orders, but actually for them in an enhanced way, or at least one that was trying to prevent the decline morally, spiritually, and what we were talking about before, right? Then you would have different other aspects, like first of all a black skull cap officially completed the habit. Again, we are not fully sure exactly which stage, which year this was issued, etc. It's normal not to have it documented precisely, right? We rely on iconographic sources, not just official issues. We know that especially in the Holy Land, in Outremer, white turbans were worn, which kind of makes sense due to the weather, the climate, and to be fresher in the first place. Also, broad-brimmed hat for the same reason could be worn, right, for protecting yourself in the shade of it. In 1259, we have yet another papal order that the brother knights, not the sergeants, right, we will have to see in another point, because they were the broader sergeants of the order, of course, would wear black mantles, as opposed to what exactly? Because they would have presumably maintained the black as a bit of a pendant. It's possible that, however, the mantles had been brown, possibly that at least these were being uniform, but again, this is just for the knights, not for the sergeants, so it's not entirely clear. We do not even understand that. The popes simply issued what the order knew, but in that sense there was not a necessity to specify. And also, by the way, it would be up to the order to eventually conform to that, which was not even just fully possible in a hyper homogeneous way. In any case, during the war they would wear also red surcoats, interestingly enough, with a white cross, which they're also sort of famous for at some point in later phase, if you look at the sort of pop representations and so on. In 1278, however, you have the previous decree revoked, and so everyone started wearing actually the red surcoat, but to battle only. So this still, again, in battle scenes is sort of more evident, but this wasn't the case for that. And the reason being, with the colors meaning, by the way, that this had to symbolize martyrdom. That will be clear also here for the Templars that had the red cross ingrained. They were, in this sense, together with the Hospitallers, the more prestigious. But the sense that when you are in combat, you are in another dimension, right, metaphysically. And so you're expected also to literally to sacrifice yourself for something that the Hospitallers deeply felt as the elite of the elite of the elite, right, among the let's say the Christian knighthood in these cases, because they were, again, together with the Templars, the Teutonic knights, the finest, right? And passing to the Templars, right, they would have worn typically, the white woolen tunic. This represented chastity, purity. They would have also a white mantle and skull cap, granted in 1128. They were initially the poor knights of Christ, right? The Templars, as they would become known. And before 1128, they dressed instead as secular knights, meaning, as we've seen also for the Hospitallers before, that there wasn't really much of a standardization in clothing, right? They wore donated cast-offs, which at this point was evidently happening just because they were sort of a different, they were an order on their own, and so they were not quite like identically secular knights. They had already established this rule, but this was also part of their humility, like the idea that they had to just serve not because of some greater desire to show off, to be again, to be distracted by that. In fact, it was all a discipline, as we will see now, as far as for example, the hair, the beard was concerned. They had all to be quite tidy about that, and of course there was a prohibition to bear personal arms, even though, I mean, the masters could and would. That was somewhat exceptional, but still, I mean, there was an effort rather to uniform this, because many members were actually previous secular knights that had lived their lives, and they were noblemen. They had their possessions, whatever. Once they entered, of course, just like if they would enter a monastery, right? They would abandon that work, the status, but they sort of were connected with the outer world as well, in a way or another, as just monks did in general. They weren't recluses or outcasts, and especially in this case. So you have the knights the Templar knights wearing a white circlet with a red cross, also finished with a mantle white. And the red cross was worn by all the brothers from 1147. The Templar sergeants instead wore a black tunic with a red cross in front and a black or brown mantle. Right, it's a bit the idea of the Apollonian and Dionysian as far as the knights and the sergeants were respectively concerned, but still in martyrdom ultimately. Right, there are lots of sort of traditional anthropological meanings, right? Meaningful information here. As we were saying, the Templars had to be neatly groomed, with hair and beard neatly trimmed. They were not allowed to wear gloves or pointed lace-up shoes or something like that. Other items of official issue dress included linen shirts, tunic, breeches, and sheepskin jerkins. The sense was all about modesty, right? Not showing off. However, it is true that some Templar knights, as well as hospitaliers, as a matter of fact, wore much more worldly garments, right? For example, bright silks, gold or silver embroidered clothes, or turbans. I mean, if you look at the ecclesiastical hierarchy, it was in a sense pretty much the same. It is true that these orders were a bit more Spartan and were supposed to be, right, just behaviorally, so they were really something different compared to any other community at the time. But it's obvious that given the heavily chivalric and feudal aristocratic nobility background of many of these guys, the importance of the same orders, their hierarchy, their international representation, the fact that they dealt again with also autonomously with different powers, etc., required some level of wealth being displayed. Some of this was legitimately, say, looked down upon, meaning that it was some sort of personal preference, customization, even provocation to the constituted order, literally. But in general, there was some degree of, again, representative wealth that was welcomed in this context. So the Teutonic Knights, instead, we have seen again the grave, the reliefs of the Hochmeister Konrad von Thüringen, that sort of exemplifies the main habit, right? Like the Templars, the Teutonic Knights wore a white habit, which was an enormous privilege that the same Templars, in fact, contested at the time, and yet the Teutonics got this from in 1244 by the Emperor Frederick II, that at the time was, basically the only hope for survival for these orders in the Holy Land. Right, Frederick II, as you know, was also king of Jerusalem, 1225-28, and his universal role was pretty much connected with the survival of these orders in the Near East, as he could be the only one who could support them, could keep supplying them, and as long as he would maintain a a sound grip on Sicily, especially next to his other, Italian and German possessions. He embodied really that close contact they could have through the Mediterranean for the universal cause, right? And these orders could support him, not just the Teutonic Knights, but the orders in general, aside from these internal rivalries. There were fears in many ways. I mean, they never really sort of betrayed each other in a serious way, but of course the competition between them was part of the way they would keep functional, also from a military point of view, because it's just like the nobility at the time. They all still considered themselves as, nobody could be the less courageous than the other. They had to prove their bravery, etc. This was important also because, as we've seen, these were essentially the most disciplined knights ever. The statutes of the Templar order regarding cavalry tactics are basically one of the most important sources in medieval warfare. We have to make a video about that because it exemplifies sort of the refined, the peak of the refined mounted tactics in the 13th century. There would be a lot really to tell about the connection of that to further developments in Europe. In any case, the Teutonic Knights secured their white habit thanks to the Hohenstaufen. The cross worn, however, was black, notoriously. Right? Before 1244, as it's clear from the same effigy of Conrad of Thuringia and various other sources, their mantles had been white, but their tunics gray. Right? The sergeants of the Teutonic Order continued, in fact, to wear gray even after. And again, the monastic code of the early 14th century shows that when representing Tannhäuser, that is actually a knight, right? So that's also important because it's possible, of course, that some Teutonic knights maintain that habit, even if it had preferably remained, as we've seen for the in the other orders, like the brown one for the Hospitallers, the black one for the Templars, etc. So the sergeantry again was different, and it would be interesting to analyze also the different asceticistic traditions of these people, also considering where they fought. I mean, as you know, the Teutonic Knights, lived in some of the most traumatically and violently and blood-bathingly underdeveloped areas in the entire continent at the time, and their brutality was hardly matched by anyone. It is not to say that the Templars or the Hospitallers were much tenderer. Again, these people were designed exclusively to slaughter large amounts of human beings as their only purpose of existence. But again, it was a close, fight in this sense and competition as far as that was concerned. We do not know how these, styles, fashions, habits were sort of influenced by that. Sergeants of the Teutonic Order wore, in the place of the cross, the three-armed tau one, also known as crux commissa, which looks very much like our capital T. And the hat was of the Teutonic Knights was white. For all the monastic military orders, the beard was actually mandatory, and there was again some, as we've seen before, regulation. It had to be kept tidy. But even for the Templars, or was it the Hospitallers, in any case, we have this specification that it had to be reasonably long, and which still included covering somebody's ears, which, at least for 21st century look, is something that appears in that case sort of more than necessary. And of course that conferred some sort of hieratic appearance to these guys. And with a beard you look more intimidating. Then, with the excuse of the habits, that we really do not know much about, telling the truth, we can discuss a bit those lesser-known military orders active specifically in the in Outre-mer during these centuries. The Order of Saint Lazarus of Jerusalem, the Order of Saint Thomas, and the Order of Montjoie. Right. The former is also known as the one of the Leper Brothers, or Jerusalem, or Lazarists. It was established in the early 12th century, and it probably turned military in 1123. Right. It was born likely few years before, like around 1119. And the order was established essentially with the primary purpose, as we understand from the name, of caring for those affected with leprosy. That was quite a common disease at the time. Their habit, well, we do not know that much about it, but it seems to have been black. From as late as the 16th century, we know that they used a green cross as a device, right? We know that King Fulk of Jerusalem officially recognized the order in 1142, and it was canonically recognized as hospitalier military order because, again, they managed a hospital, right? So the hospitalier doesn't quite mean just the order, again, of St. John, Malta, as it would become later. It really, I don't know, also the Teutonic order had been born as a hospital, right? But as a military order as well of chivalry, under the rule of Saint Augustine, and this was confirmed in a papal bull Cum a nobis petitur by Pope Alexander in 1255, right? And in spite of their foundational activity for caring about the lepers, looking after the lepers, the Order of Saint Lazarus was militarily active. At the Battle of La Forbie in 1244, they fought as much as in the defense of Acre in 1291. We've seen it in the video about the siege. So there were other orders, of course. It wasn't just the other only ones. And the order's main seats were, before the fall of Jerusalem, in this, of course, in the very city, and later in Acre, right? It transferred after the fall, 1187, and after the Saint Kingdom of Jerusalem fell entirely, you have the Order of Saint Lazarus splitting in two branches, one in Italy and one in France. The latter specifically at the Château Royal de Boigny-sur-Billon. And speaking of the Knights of St. Thomas of Canterbury at Acre, also known as St. Elmas Aachen as an order, was, albeit Thomas Becket was actually sort of a universal Western Christian saint. This was specifically an English order, right, established in 1191. It turned military likely around the 20s of the 13th century, so relatively late. And it also exemplifies how, again, many orders would be born just with non-military mansions originally, and then they would provide themselves with protection. This was the case, I don't know, if you think about the Teutonic order protecting the German pilgrims, for example. Many of these groups, as historical, like think about the Normans, right? They had been born as contractors of some way, as escorts for the pilgrims to the Holy Land, etc. Their habit was white, with a red cross with white scallop shell at center. That's very make it recognizable. Do not confuse it with Santiago, that also has the shell, but we will see it better in another video about, again, the Iberian orders. And when the order of St. Thomas was founded, of course, the city of Acre had been recaptured by Richard I of England and Philip Augustus of France, and William, a chaplain to the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, formed this small religious order, in fact in Acre, that was pretty universally vowing to poverty, chastity, and obedience. And also in this case, there was an hospitalier function. At least it was the primary purpose of the order, caring about the sick and the wounded, right? And also mortuary functions, such as burying the Christian knights that died in combat, right? So it's pretty somber mentality. Just think about what these guys were doing it for. This is not a video to explain why, but we have made multiple videos about Holy War during Crusades times, and so this is all part of a of course of a continuity with the afterlife as well. It continues for these warriors beyond for serving Christ, fighting against Satan in the end time. And William, as the prior of the order, also raised funds to ransom Christian captives from Saladin's Muslim armies, right? Not just Christians, by the way, but still, we talk about the Turcopoles and other Muslims that fought in Crusader armies. And this order was importantly successful, so much so that it brought to the establishment of a church, of a hospital dedicated to Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, that had been martyrized, after all, just a few decades before, in 1170. So the English men who founded the order had sort of this fresh memory of it. And during the Sixth Crusade, so we're talking 1227, 1229, you have the Bishop Peter of Roche militarizing the order, as we were saying before. Probably this had already happened, right? There were already knights in the Order of St. Thomas. And this, however, was instrumental specifically to the defense of Jaffa and Sidon during that crusade. So in 1236, Gregory IX also confirmed the order, right, from his papal authority. And the order adopted at that point the rule of the Teutonic Knights, right, as a discipline. We have seen just recently with, the Cluniac Order, etc., that, of course, the rules could be shared. They would stem all from a basic principle, some sort of broader monastic identity that had developed in sort of homogeneous way in the Christian West. So for a century, St. Thomas Order defended Acre, given that, as we've seen, that they had been born in the Third Crusade with Acre's reconquest, and Jerusalem had already fallen. So the order focused at that point towards a more military role, given the dire straits in which the rest of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was versing, and this brought to a compaction of power within the same order. In fact, alongside the aforementioned acquisition of the Teutonic rule, a master acquired power over what will remain the more religiously functional figure of the prior, where the master was in charge of more the military affairs, right? And St. Thomas' Order also branched into the British Isles. Its headquarters was in Cheapside, London, and there was a branch also in Kilkenny, interestingly enough. And it was not a very prosperous order, telling the truth. Edward I, I made a bit about him, in 1279 was asked for funds. There were debates regarding the necessity of the Order of St. Thomas merging with one of the Knights Templar was naturally much larger and more powerful. But these English Crusaders were quite proud, after all, and the albeit discussions were held. The idea of merging with the Templars was refused, both in Outremer and in Britain. In 1316, the members successfully appealed to Edward I, however, against a Templar takeover, which had still somehow gained foot as an idea. And there was yet another attempt by the Bonhomme convent at Ashridge, which is just another internal note. Speaking of the Knights of Our Lady of Montjoie, also known as the Knights of Truffaut, after 1187, this was a Spanish order, right? It was confirmed by the Pope in 1180. But it withdrew from the Holy Land after the fall of Jerusalem in 1187, or at least properly the Battle of Hattin. Right? These Crusaders came back to the Iberian Peninsula, and they were absorbed by the Knights of Calatrava, another Spanish order, in 2021. So they were short-lived. Their habit was white. They had a party-colored red and white cross. The order of Montjoie, later known as the Order of Truffaut, was founded, as we've seen, at the end of the 12th century by a Galician count, Rodrigo Alvarez, albeit not in his home, but in the kingdom of Aragon, specifically in the castle of Alfambra. These things, again, were a territorial to some degree, at least the initial union, what was seen as, again, a brotherhood. And so it only eventually, in case especially of success, would branch out and settle down and sort of be founded and so on, with assets, etc. Would take it a more territorial, permanent center. All right. And originally, this order was established to protect the Christian pilgrims in the Iberian Peninsula. It's only in the Third Crusade, as we've seen, they arrived in the Holy Land, and the headquarters of the order was established in Jerusalem, on Montjoie. Right, this was a hill, after which the order was called, because it was the promontory from which these Iberian Crusaders saw Jerusalem first. Right, so they call it as the Mountain of Joy in the lingua franca of the time. It was French, in the Holy Land, and this wouldn't last for long, as you understand, because Jerusalem was to fall 70 years later. However, the order had started with let's say, an important foot, like they had adopted the Cistercian rule, interestingly enough, to show, of course, the superimposition also between the monastic-military orders and the sort of the simple monastic ones out there. And we'll talk about the Cistercians more. Just recently we talked about the Cluniacs, but as you know, the Cistercians are the next step, right? Also devoted to hard work, right? Land exploitation, farming, and more. Some knights of the order of Montjoie fought in the same Battle of Hattin, right? And the reason why the order bailed out of the Holy Land after that battle is that all the participants there died, right? All the members of the order participating to the battle fell on that day. So this brought to an internal crisis of the order, especially with the leadership that brought in 1196 to the establishment of a new order, the one of Montjoie in Castile. The Aragonese elements of the order, again, this happened only in a few years, like it's a few decades, merged with the Templars instead, right? As we've seen, the Order of St. Thomas was to make the same end, hadn't there been an opposition. So what happened eventually is that Ferdinand III of Castile, in 1221, united the order of Monfragüe with the one of Calatrava. And that's how it went. The order of Montesa in 1317 tried to reestablish, in part, the Montjoie order after the suppression of the Templars, because it felt like it was a sort of local congregation that would give prestige to the land, also considering again the martyrdom and Hattin and all the implications of that. But there are also very political and ruthlessly so games behind all these orders, and so everything should be better contextualized. That's not what we're doing specifically in this video, but I thought it was interesting to compare these orders to see some of the differences, starting from the habit, but as you understand here, digressing also a bit on the history of the same orders, and again especially about the former, the three main ones we'll keep talking about profusely, time allowing. I'm fairly satisfied. I don't remember how many videos I have in the Monastic-military order playlist. It's somewhat significant. And there is another aspect of... Here we are. There are 8 videos, but there are not so many. But essentially we have 1, 2, 3 about the Teutonic Order. No, actually 4 about the Teutonic Order. 1 about the Hospitallers, 1 about the Templars, and the others are just in general about the Monastic-military order. Well, we should surely have to do a lot more, and this will be the 9th. And in fact, I would like to bring the attention endly to one interesting aspect that is actually at the end of the Outremer adventure, beyond it actually, dating to 1305, where when crusading treatise was proposed with the plan of uniting all the military orders. Yes, this is not okay, it was crazy in some ways, but it was still responding to the aforementioned need to protect, say, these institutions. Look at what was happening to the Templars. Say the Teutonic Knights were the luckiest because they had, at least for another century, a good footing until the Battle of Tannenberg, and that was a real state in many ways, and also in a land, as we've seen, that didn't have a state otherwise. And so this was just a bit of a chivalric ideal, right? And we talk about this because if we were to describe the habit of this new order, right, we know that it would have been black with a red cross, very much inspired, as you understand, to the Hospitallers. And this is fascinating, actually, to the Hospitallers and the Templars, right? So a bit as a, melancholic, idea of the sin of the world, but martyrdom still being out there. And what is mind-blowing is they actually discussed that. They actually planned to even to deal with this. Okay, let's do it. Let's find a habit, a uniform, and let's all unite. This is fantastic. It wasn't done, but it's fascinating enough to see how, after all, Christendom, in a time in which we usually say, the Crusaders were over, or Europe was tired, whatever. Yes, of course, there had been a major setback with the loss of the Holy Land, but there were lots of Westerners in the Levant, as you know, with even really important presence about Rhodes, Cyprus, right, and just many Westerners that went fighting, even in the Crusades that continued in those years in Smyrna, for example, against the Turks, etc. So there is really a lot of that history that is overlooked. The Crusades were not over. They thought, okay, it's normal to go to a crusading expedition every once in a while, somebody from your community to leave there, and it would go really on and on, right? There is no need to arrive until the 18th century, but still then there were crusades in Europe, and we sort of have forgotten that and sort of wanted to pretend that the crusade was just like an old idea of traditions that is kind of bad, because there's kind of, we are about progress and modernity, but progress and modernity, if you want to call them like that, happen exactly while these aristocracies partaking in these enterprises were doing that regularly and were fully aware of their Christian duties. In spite of the difficulties, there was a civilizational crisis kicking in for Eurasia. I mean, in the 14th centuries are not, just times like others, right? This is not the video to discuss that specifically, nor why the Crusades had in the Near East had happened, and it's limiting also just to talk about that, even though of course the Holy Land was the most important prize there, and also for practical purposes. But also the following, right? And you know that I also dedicate myself every once in a while to the Turkish wars. We talk about this broader crusade ideal in some depth, and so I'm always glad again seeing this playlist being expanded, like of what we're doing so far. And there is still a lot to do. I like the idea that someone can count this channel, searching for the playlists, finding them randomly, and sort of entering this world, because they these are things that just are not very much discussed in the first place. I care about them as a medievalist, as a military historian, but I try always to make this content, yes, detailed in some depth, but always explaining the purpose, why. I could simply list you all the habit devices or colors or whatever, and that's it. But I think it's better to actually explain what's behind that, right, in a political, moral, cultural terms. And we will, of course, get back also to the strictly military dimension. That is the one where you see what these guys were really made of. Very well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.